so much of our history, our ancestor history, was preserved through sound. Our ancestors used the slave ship as a mode of communication with each other. They were able to use the infrastructure of this prison to communicate with each other. What was lost by us not being able to record that history has been embedded and encoded into sound.
Welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. My guest today is Jazsalyn, creative and curatorial director of Black Beyond, a radical space for artists and activists to define alternate realities for Blackness. As an anti-disciplinary artist, Jazsalyn combines new media and community organizing practices to reimagine Black futures and to decolonize and re-indigenize social and creative practice. Her work has been featured in Cultured Magazine, Vogue, The New Yorker, and Huffington Post. Jazsalyn was interviewed for today's episode by Michelle McCrary. Michelle is a daughter, granddaughter, niece, cousin, mother, wife, and friend who lives on occupied Duwamish land in the Pacific Northwest. She has roots in coastal Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, and when she's not leading the communications team at Esalen, she's training to become a facilitator with the Healing and Reconciliation Institute, tending to her winter garden, reading her way through a massive pile of books on her nightstand, and working on the screenplay for her horror anthology. Before we turn to their conversation, last year, Friends of Esalen helped us to survive closures due to the pandemic, fires, and mudslides. We're here today because of you. When you become a friend of Esalen with a donation, your contribution helps us finance our day-to-day operations in Big Sur, from staff to infrastructure. This year, our goal is to raise $450,000 and to make 300 new friends so that we can continue to keep our doors open for generations to come. So become a friend now. Go to esalen.org/give. Now here's our conversation with Jazsalyn.
So Sam teed us up a little bit, but I feel like we need to let the people know who we are. I can start if that works better for you. My name is Michelle McCrary, and I have been running the comms team here at Esalen since November of 2020. And I am a daughter, a granddaughter, a wife, a friend, and I just am. I come from a long line of folks from Georgia who are Geechee by way of Sierra Leone. And on my dad's side, on my paternal side, I come from a long line of folks from North Carolina with indigenous roots, Tuscarora, Deer Clan to be exact. So that is who I am. Who are you, Jazsalyn?
Well, I love that you said you're a Geechee girl. I also recently found out I'm a Geechee girl. So nice to meet you, fellow Geechee girl.
Yes.
I mean, we know each other, but now we know each other.
Exactly.
Yes. So as Geechee girl, I'm also from the South, North Carolina to be specific, and then also extending across the Atlantic to West Africa. Recently, I found out that predominantly Nigerian, Cameroonian, and Ghanaian.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's my heritage. Digging in deeper, there's some Southeast Asian going on in the DNA as well. So yeah, still unpacking that. But to speak about like who I am, what I do, I'm a multidisciplinary artist. I prefer anti-disciplinary because with these labels in themselves, that comes restrictions. And, I'm just very anti in regards to feeling like restricted or label, more so thinking about how can we be expansive outside of being confined.
I love that. And I love that that consideration, because I feel like words mean things. And when I hear discipline, I think punitive, I think carceral, and I think about all of those places where I'm growing in my understanding around abolition. And I'm very, very new to considering those pieces. And a deep part of that is like unpacking language for me. So it's really cool to hear you say that. I also want to kind of touch into why we're doing it and why this is not Sam kind of interviewing someone. And in full transparency, one of the big reasons, aside from, the opportunity to work at Esalen itself and the beautiful land, the artist in residence program was a really big part of why I came on board. And I've had the honor of being on the artist in residence committee. And I also have the honor of speaking with all the artists sort of after their experience. So most of the artists I've kind of sat in conversation with and had a little bit of after experience. And I reach out to pretty much everyone, or I try to before they start. We were in conversation and it turned into a vibe. And it turned into like a whole piece around like all these connections that we kind of made in that conversation. You expressed to me that you really wanted to, as a part of like your experience, and like, if this feels correct, you could correct me, like a offering of your experience and a part of like your work, you wanted to sit down and have the conversation, like the similar kind of conversation we had when we sat down that first time, and then we sat down again.
Yeah, every time we sit down, there's as much tea to share. And
Yes. And as two Black women, kind of having a similar kind of experience with the place, I feel like we connected there. And yeah, that's why we decided to do it like this, because it was sort of a way to extend your work and like your experience, and like I felt like it felt like an offering of like your work and your process as an artist. Does that feel accurate?
yeah, or just like beyond being an artist, but just being, which
Yeah.
I really love how you grounded our conversation by saying, I just am. And then like the levels of being a daughter, being a mother,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah.
But yeah, just being.
Yeah. So we got into that conversation. So this is why we're doing it. And I'm really excited to do it. And we also, in that conversation, talked a little bit about artists in residence as like a program, and kind of Esalen's deep legacy and connection to artists. I think lineage is really powerful. And my approach to kind of understanding and communicating about Esalen is kind of coming from that space of lineage and trying to like hit those touch points. And really, we have a lot of work to do in that space, because there is a lineage and a connection and a sense of place that we have not touched on as an organization, from a story standpoint, from practical standpoint, that we're in process of doing. And that work is with the Esalen tribe and kind of doing the work around healing and reconciliation. But for me, part of that work is lineage and starting from those pieces. So yeah, like what attracted you to this artist in residence program?
Yeah, I think just coming off of a year plus of doing heavy organizing work, building out the foundation for Black Beyond, which is a radical space for artists and activists to define and speculate alternate realities for Blackness. But in doing so and creating this space, having to put my own personal art practice on hold for the most part. Yeah, wanting a place of reflection and of transition, feeling like that was a critical point that I was reaching in my life is what appealed to me about Esalen.
Yeah, and you were defending your dissertation that whole time you were there, right?
Yes, I was. So trying to find as much rest in the midst of doing that as possible.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
yeah, I feel like
yeah.
I was somewhat successful, at least like having a change of scenery and that being such a sacred place in doing so.
Yeah, and I just want to, honor the Esalen tribe and the Esalen people, for allowing us to be on that land and allowing us all to experience that. And if people want to find out more we'll put it in the show notes, but the Esalen tribe of Monterey County, who we're in conversations of healing and reconciliation with, they have really great stories about what that land was used for, and the healing properties of that land are very much a part of their story. So I encourage folks to go and check out their website, and we'll make sure that people have that information so that they could do that. What jumped out for me about your work is sound. And I could have gone with music, but I was really specific about sound because as I kind of dug into Black Beyond, there were like a couple of things that came up for me around sound and how the folks in sort of, I would call it like a collective. It's because it's a group of artists. It feels like a movement of artists. Sound is a really central part of that. So could you just talk about that piece? And like, let's get into that. And I'm going to hold my questions about the Detroit House piece because I got excited when I found out about that work that you were doing. But we're going to talk about sound, and we're going to focus this conversation and this question on sound.
Well, I mean, I think it's definitely all connected, in my opinion. So sound and the sonic realm has always been an inspiration for my personal work. And through my work, I'm like more so interested in world building, and there's nothing more visceral or compelling than sound. And then I started to unpack this as it pertains to Blackness, which is relevant to a course that I'm teaching right now called Alt Reality at Parsons School of Design. I'm co-teaching with author and techno sound artist DeForest Brown Jr. But I actually want to read a few quotes that I pulled from an article that we were referencing in this class, and then also in a workshop series that I did with Black Beyond called Deadly Notes, Atlantic Soundscapes, Writing the Middle Passage by Danielle Chicon. So in the words of another author, the poet James Field Stanfield, fearful sounds, deadly notes, trembling rage, reverberate through the bodies of slaving ships. He continues, and one long groan, the feeble throng unite, one strain of anguish wastes the lengthened night. Out of discordant voices, he suggests emerged sounds that combine with a polyphonic chorus to contest the abstraction and inhumanity of the slave trade. These sonic gestures transform radical unbelonging into potentially a form of radical resistance. Radical perhaps precisely because it cannot be reproduced by the record. It is no easy task to reconstruct these Atlantic soundscapes. Sound fades, only writing remains. These experiences are beyond what language can describe. And his passage into slavery is also suggests a passage into an Atlantic soundscape defined by the voices of the enslaved rather than the written record of the captors. By understanding the writing of the Middle Passage as an early audio technology rather than simply a history of exploitation, we can think about sound as a new language of resistance, perhaps particular to pathways of the Middle Passage and embedded in the writing itself.
Ooh, that feels like a word.
Yes.
And there are a couple of pieces that that are kind of occurring to me as you talk about that, because I've heard the phrase before, and please pardon me for the attribution if you have it, please do, the technology of Blackness. And that kind of comes up, and I never really considered the sound and the sounds of the Middle Passage as another kind of possibility for kind of technology.
Yeah, I know. Like that passage in itself is like you have to let it sit there and
that kind of wrecked
resonate.
me. So I'm trying to like orient, because I was like, what? Just it's visceral, and that's what I appreciate about your work and why I asked you about sound, because it's like it's very visceral, and it's bringing up for me a course that I took recently through Communiversity with Dr. Coco Selassie, and she talked a lot about ontology and Blackness, and like so many things are foundational to just being, like we talked about. And I feel like sound is one of those things.
For sure. Yeah. And I feel like it gets overlooked, especially in the quote unquote academy,
Mm-hmm.
in these spaces where it's like here in this text, they're speaking about the record and about written history and what they're speaking to. It's such a great article, but like what they're getting at is who had the power to write history and then what was lost through that sound. But then like what I've been tapping to and like why this article has been such gold for me because it has put to words what I've had difficulty putting into words myself.
Mm-hmm.
Although I do write, that's not like my first, it's not the first tool I grab when it comes to express myself. But yeah, what they're like justifying here is that so much of our history, our ancestor history was preserved through sound.
Mm.
What was lost by us not being able to record that history has been embedded and encoded into sound. And like even like other parts of this article is speaking about how our ancestors used the slave ship as a mode of communication with each other. Even like slave ships that were overturned, they were able to use the infrastructure of this prison, this
Mm-hmm.
ship-like prison to communicate with each other. And especially because like there's different tribes that are on the slave ship from different parts of the continent who
Yeah.
aren't able to communicate with each other. They had to revolt, rely back on the power and sound as a technology. And thinking about like radical resistance and how that's tied to sound and the evolution of sound, especially amongst the diaspora and on the continent. When you consider that and then zoom out and see how music has evolved amongst the diaspora and how our radical existence and resistance is embedded and encoded from that experience on that slave ship. It's mind blowing, and which which connects back to like Detroit techno, Detroit house, and especially how like those two genres in itself, in my opinion, are like the soundtrack of resistance and like a critical turning point in Black people seeing themselves in the future.
Ooh, okay. I want to start a couple of places. One is this piece that I feel is there about creation inside of profound trauma and destruction. And that is when I first talked to you, I was talking to you about Bayo Okolomafe's work. And like he has this idea of Blackness as fugitive and like a sense of emergence coming from times of chaos, and that the how times of chaos and trauma and pain can be sites of deep and profound sort of creation. And that's kind of what came up for me when you were just talking about this consideration of sound inside of that middle passage experience. So I feel like we could go so deep here, and that's why I feel like it's a lot heavier than music. And I love that you make that connection. And bringing up the Detroit house piece, we also kind of got into this discussion before about the erasure of Black people. Talk about that in the context of sound and silence and the erasure, that kind of erasure from that genre of music as a kind of like how that works inside of sound and like, a silencing of that ability of Black folks to see ourselves in the future and in that kind of music.
Yes, like you said, there's so many different avenues and places to go in this conversation. But yeah, like this is something that we've touched based on in the course Alt Reality. And we've discussed how like with this article, Deadly Notes, how that experience that itself and like who has the power to write history is kind of connected to who had the power to rewrite history with Detroit techno. Techno specifically, because techno has its origins in Detroit with Juan Atkins. who, it's still like, living legend we have today. And then it was rebranded in Europe, in Berlin. So we have these legends who are still among us today, who they don't receive the respect that they should. And I don't have the answer for that. I feel like my co-instructor digs into this deeper into their book that's coming out about how Berlin in particular was able to rebrand techno as a European sound. But I do realize that there has been some sort of like reckoning with like artists who aren't particularly Black, but who make a living in this space, creating techno music, who are, because of the uprisings last year, want to give respect and acknowledge that these origins of this music, this dance music that has taken the world by storm since, early 90s, late 80s, is specific to Black struggle and to Black radical resistance.
Yeah, and I hear you on that piece. And I feel like, again, that touches on what you were speaking about in terms of lineage and the importance of those connections. And like, there's something that's kind of coming up for me around like, when you're outside of that lineage, those conversations that are very much happening now around Black creators and appropriation, and not just Black creators, but creators of color, broadly Indigenous creators. Like, when you are outside of that lineage, what is your duty to honor that lineage, and how do you interact with that lineage then in a way that's not extractive? And I feel like that's a really kind of interesting discussion to have in the context that we're sitting right now.
It's such a fine line, but there's just been like, there's ways that you can give back, it's like a form of reparations, like maybe setting a percentage aside of your paycheck that is specific to a certain culture. Like, if you're making a living that has its origins within a certain culture, and especially if that culture and those people are struggling. Come on, look at like Detroit, like this is the mecca of this quote unquote genre. How do you set aside reparations to give back to the origins, to Detroit?
Right. And I think that, we could go off on a whole tangent there about how people really understand reparations.
Okay, like, repair.
what that means. But
I appreciate you saying it like that, because I feel like people get triggered when they hear the word reparations.
There's gonna be a lot of people triggered,
Yes. Yeah. So it's like, okay, let's like spell it out. Let's sound it out. Repair the damage that you might have done directly or indirectly, or that you benefit from. Repair it.
Yeah. And I think that there's also, I want to name that concerted effort that's happening now to sort of erase an understanding and a deeper contextualization of history and how history moves to sort of obscure that need for repair, trying to, in the pursuit of like binaries of good and bad, right and wrong, there's like a real easy escape hatch to sort of try to not really grapple with what it really means to repair. And again, I think that goes back to the piece about abolition and like, what does it mean to even have these conversations in a culture where everything is about just like punishment and with no pathway to repair, where people like, I feel like people get taken out of the conversation because nobody is discussing like a pathway to repair.
Are you ready to gift yourself more time at Esalen this winter season? With the week-long self-guided exploration program, you'll have more time to learn, connect, and reflect. Spend 5 days and 4 nights in Big Sur and soak in the baths, experience Esalen massage, and explore our menu of open classes. As an added bonus, when you reserve Premium Plus, Point House, and Point House Plus accommodations for a week-long self-guided exploration program, An Esalen massage will be included with your stay. Dates from November to December are still available, but going fast, so book now at esalen.org/learn. And now back to Michelle and Jazsalyn.
Yeah, just thinking about like reparations and then being in quote unquote communities or scenes. Another reason like why I dug into the history and the origins of techno experimental, like electronic experimental music, was also because I was living in New York, living on this scene, and techno music was so prevalent and there was no Black people around. There was like a handful of us. And even when I would try to have conversations about like techno or house music, like there's this one house, I guess, collective called Soul Summit, and they would have like these dance, club dance music, kind of like raves in the middle of the day, but it was like more so a family function. Like it was like a bunch of Black people out in the middle of Fort Greene, Brooklyn, and there was just like food, like it would happen like I think the first Saturday of each month during the summer. Yeah. And then like there would be like, non-Black people that would come out to that function where it's like, like we have no issue with like who shows up, like, come, even though there's a saying like who's invited to the cookout. I mean, everybody was invited to the cookout of Soul Summit.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would just like have conversations with like, quote unquote acquaintances on the scene about, yeah, like this origins of this music is Black. It's so great to see like my people out here appreciating and like thriving as a part of this community quote scene. And yeah, the reaction that I would get to that is just like confusion. And this is like, mind you, this is like a year ago.
Whew.
Yeah. Wow. And so that's why it was so important for me to reveal this history as much as I could. And to share that history with like our community, our Black community, because like we also don't acknowledge our contributions to many popular genres that get rebranded as essentially not being a part of our history. Yeah. So
I feel like we move at the speed of kind of like our own brilliance and like constant state of creation, because that creation, to get way back again to that idea of just being, that kind of creation, because it's just a part of a cultural piece, a way of being and existing, that's how we're moving at the speed of that, because we're creating for something as a way of living and as a way of being and surviving and thriving. So I feel like that it's so weird to talk about art for me sometimes, because there's like a real separation in this culture that feels strange to like African culture, indigenous African culture, around art being like separate, and art not as like a part of a deep expression of just a way of cultural being connected to like cosmology, like language, all those pieces. Does that make sense?
No, yeah, totally. I think it's just like there's like an innate spirit within me that also resonates with that, because even like calling myself an artist, maybe that's like why I lean towards the anti-disciplinary artist, because in the West, it feels like things exist in silos. And I mean, I'm not too privy to like, how things are on the continent, so I'm not gonna claim that I do. But all I can speak to is like some inner spirit inside myself that doesn't feel the need to have to separate these different components of myself to create some sort of identity. But like instead, I exist within my own internal ecosystem, my own internal universe that is also a part of a bigger universe.
Yeah. And I say that totally as a layperson too, as someone who is like, studied African art at like a very like, sort of base, and even saying that was weird to me, but studied that at a very sort of baseline level, but also in the kind of courses that I've been taking and the readings that I've been doing now, it is very apparent to me that that is the case. There's a real integrated way of being that is, I think, that what I'm hearing you say, you've retained culturally. It's somewhere in your memory. It's somewhere in your genetic memory. So just in the same way we can have genetic memory of trauma and pain, we have that genetic memory of like that is generative and that is creative and like allows us to move kind of inside of these sort of oppressive structures. So I hear you on that. I would trust that feeling. I trust that feeling because it comes from somewhere deep.
Right.
Yeah.
Tapping into the DNA, into that memory.
Yeah.
The biomemory.
Yeah. And when you talk about world building and world building in your work and world building through not only just landscapes, but soundscapes, that's coming from somewhere. So that's what
I'm letting that resonate. Thank you. Thank you. Cause like I'm such a visual person, such a visual artist. That comes very naturally to me. And I definitely do feel like I have an ear for sound, but creating with sound is so abstract. So it's been a process for me to ease into. Like it's one thing to be a creator of sound, but then to actually build and create with sound, that's a whole other realm.
Yeah, it's two discrete things. And when you think about DJs as curators and creators of sound, it's like two different things happening. And we got into that whole discussion about this because, I disclosed that in my wild youth, I was known to frequent a dancery.
Okay. I thought you were going to say you used to, spin on the ones and twos. I was about to ask, like, what was your name?
That was a lot of my friends. I still to this day have a lot of friends who are DJs. But I was out there, hitting the floor to the floor.
Okay. Yeah. So you were on the scene. I see you. We see each other.
And, we're not going to get into carbon dating, but, I think I predated the scene you discussed.
Well, no. So that's why I had to go back to talk about Soul Summit. So Soul Summit are like the OG DJs from like the New York house and techno scene. More so house.
And when you said that to me, I'm thinking of Soul Summit. I'm thinking about Fort Greene, and I'm trying to recall where, because I feel like I have been.
You've been, yes. Like honestly, there's this place. So in Bed-Stuy, there's this restaurant called, it's slipping my mind, but the owner is actually from North Carolina, but it also is a discotheque, and I'm so sad that I can't remember the name of it. And so they honestly like they rent out their place sometimes, and like there'll be like techno raves and stuff at this restaurant that like also functions or used to function as a discotheque. And
my memory, it sounds so familiar, but oh my goodness, I need some ginkgo biloba because I can't hold it because I feel it and I can see it. And now I'm going to have to go back to the group chat with this, and I know they'll come back with it because it is just escaping me, but it feels very familiar to me. And it's like, how you go to places and you don't really know what they're called, but you kind of go because somebody is spinning there that you like, and you're just going to go.
Yes. It's the spot. It's the spot around the corner.
Yes. Because I have friends who still live in Fort Greene to this day. And when I was living back on the East Coast, hanging out there, I know we probably have been, but my memory is just like, but yeah, that's how we got into this conversation. And then I started pulling out books and showing you things.
Yo, if you're not pulling out a book on me, then like we're not having a real conversation. I feel like anytime I'm on a call with someone, they start grabbing books, and that's how you know it's real.
Yeah, I know. I just ran right over to I was like, wait, have you read this? I was like, wait, have you seen this? Yeah. So thank you for, kind of bringing us back and like connecting those dots to that conversation because I really, it fascinates me. And I'm going to keep digging into that. I feel like a Detroit house rabbit hole coming on in my spirit. And I was just kind of like, I saw a Spotify list. I was like, I need to look at this Spotify list and see what's up and really, really dig into that. So kind of coming back to, doing this work, coming to Esalen for the Artist in Residence program, acknowledging that we're having this discussion at a primarily, historically white institution, to ostensibly the same audience. We don't know that yet because we have yet to run our surveys of the audience for the podcast, but we're going to run on some, scientific assumption. How do you, and I feel like this is something we do as Black people all the time. We're often, when we're not together, or as I think Tressie McMillan Cottom calls it, in circumstances where we are legible. And I feel like Esalen is one of those spaces where we are not legible, aka in context in a certain way. How do you come to a place like Esalen doing this very, very Black work in a space that may not?
Yes, I understand. Like, we just have to be real, as my mother say, be real.
Yes.
Be you.
Again, being. For the academics, ontology.
Ontology. Okay. Yes.
Ontological.
Yes.
Shout out to Dr. Coco Selassie.
Okay. I'm getting all ontological right now.
Yes.
So as I had mentioned, I was seeking rest as a revolutionary act. And yes.
Shout out to
and
the Nat
really
ministry.
Okay. Yes. Shout out to them. Such an inspiration. But Esalen allowed me the space to do that to the most extent that I was willing to. Not necessarily willing to, but just given the personal circumstances that I could. And as I mentioned, Big Sur is truly a sacred land, and I'm glad that I was able to visit, and the artist residency allowed me to do that. I do want to say that it was a bit of a culture shock. I'm used to doing this work in or adjacent to white spaces, but I do think that Big Sur is quite removed from the rest of the world, which can make it difficult to have these radical conversations on topics such as race and equity, not necessarily because it's not a conversation that wants to be had, but it's just even in spaces in New York in particular, that being a quote unquote art capital, and or in academic spaces, there is a level of education and awareness that happens in those spaces. So it's just the conversations aren't so unfamiliar, or there's just a certain level of vocabulary that has been established amongst groups that I was doing this work in. And it made me realize that, okay, I am living in a bubble. I am existing in a bubble. I am doing this work in a bubble. And then also wanting to focus on rest. It's well, I have to decide how much work I want to do to bring people to that level in order to have these conversations.
I feel like that's real and that's fair. And I think in trying to give a little space to the artists in the kind of inception of the program, the real space for that exchange was sort of in process, and kind of hearing this again and trying to understand that and trying to iterate is a place where I think we've landed. And I think that's real for you. Kind of still speaking in the context of sort of being in these spaces, sort of predominantly white spaces, doing work meant for Black people. I feel like we should have a choice to decide if we even want to translate.
Right. It's a lot of code switching. Code switching is work.
Yeah. And I think that's your right as the person who's birthing this work. But I think it's a real question when you're doing work like yours in these institutions. Yeah, and it's real.
It is real. Yeah. I mean, because when applying to Esalen, that is, and as I had just mentioned, like rest was a priority. And so then, and I was coming from a place of needing rest, of doing this work in a predominantly white institution, and just all the inherent obstacles that come along with doing that. So I had to make a conscious decision to decide that, okay, to stay true to why I intended to come here, and that was because I needed this moment of rest in order to continue to do the work that I am doing. And I mean, it like while being here, it made me think about what does human potentiality really mean, for all humans, Black humans,
Yeah.
Indigenous humans, humans who don't even have access to Big Sur or places like Esalen. And then how do we empower the people who are a part of these communities, a part of the community at Esalen in particular, who are still trying to do this work? And to extended communities who have to return to the havoc and ruins of the real world, such as myself. We can't stay in, the beautiful land of Big Sur forever.
Yeah, and I hear you. And I'm feeling my own kind of grappling with that sense of questioning, a sense of urgency I feel around the need to do the work to make space for that kind of equity at a place like Esalen, while also trying to not only give the organization grace, but give myself grace, because it's a real trick bag. It's a trick bag to be, someone who's employed by the place. And I think it maybe what I'm hearing from you, it's a little bit of a trick bag to be somebody who's coming to like experience the place in that context. And I think it's complicated. And that piece that you said about, it's not that these conversations are not wanting to be had, but it's like, how do the people who are most affected adversely by these systems that created spaces like Esalen, really defining our rules for engagement around our energetic and spiritual output to kind of, bring about the shifts that need to happen, as two people who are not like, being paid to do that kind of labor, but we still sort of wind up doing that labor anyway, I think is where I'm landing.
Right. We do that labor because we care. Like I
Yeah.
was, like speaking to what I said earlier, like creating the space of Black Beyond, a lot of that responsibility has fallen on myself to create this space. And it has, as a result, made me put my own personal art practice on hold. So, I mean, that was like another part of the art residency program, is I wanted space to try to get back to that. But still, time didn't really allow. But I do think that the art residency program, I do think that is a great start about like bringing people into, the community at Esalen. But I do think that like it is important to think about like how do we move beyond just representation and tokenism, and how do like we provide this empowerment, this support, like I'm glad we're having this conversation, because like this conversation essentially is part of the work. But it's like, yeah, but it's like, how do we move past conversation and like building this support and infrastructure to bring this conversation to action, to real impact? Does that look like bringing in groups of people opposed to just individuals? Of Black, Indigenous creatives and culture workers, providing leadership positions for Black, Indigenous people in the community, specifically Esalen, or supporting Black, Indigenous initiatives to create their own spaces of retreat, of refuge, their own art residency programs as an extended community, or get as an extended component in community with Esalen, etc.
Yes. And, we have had this conversation. And I think these are all things that I think about. And I think about, I feel responsible to my own community, and especially my own community of I feel responsible. Let me just backtrack. I feel responsible to my community, A. And anywhere I go, I feel that responsibility. And then the second piece of that is that I feel, no matter how grown everybody is coming and kind of making their own choices, I feel responsible primarily to the Black people who come to Esalen, and also, any Indigenous people who might come to Esalen, but really primarily to Black people and Black women who come to Esalen about that experience. And, to be really transparent, questioning my own courage around what am I doing? Am I doing enough to sort of like enact that change? And also wondering, like, ultimately, like, in doing that, am I really serving that my own community in that? What am I really contributing to inside of this, like, sort of like predominantly white space? Like, is it the best use of my time to push for that inside of that space? I think that's what I'm really trying to, I grapple with that, just to be transparent. And it's a hard point of transparency, when you can just go off and make your own. But that's not so easy and simple because of the way the systems are set up.
Okay.
The access to the capital and even the land and the complications around being on Indigenous land, and how do you do that ethically and morally, and like, when you do these pieces, when you're speaking specifically about these creating spaces, physical spaces of rest and creativity for Black and Indigenous artists and other artists of color, like, what is that construction like?
Yeah, I feel that. I mean, it reminds me of one of the recent events that Black Beyond had called Origins, which was an extended reality experience reimagining Black film futures. At Origins, we had a series of artist talks, and one artist, Camera, who is also leading activation residency, which is centering Black trans lives, had said something about imagination being romanticized, when in reality, imagination is damn hard work, and how to navigate that. And yeah, and I think we can only do so much. It's like, who is in leadership, who has the power at these institutions, and if they want to provide that space and that support to do this work, then there's only so much that we can do. And I'm glad to have this space to have this conversation with you, so that, we planted those seeds. So hopefully we can grow into, hopefully we all can grow into this community that is truly equitable, and full of human potential.
Exactly, because the only lasting truth is change.
Yes, is that an Octavia Butler reference?
It might be.
Right, comes full circle. Yes. She is such an inspiration.
Yeah.
Let her legacy live on.
Yes, and we did not even get into the Afrofuturism pieces, but that's another piece that I wanted to get into that with you. But I feel like this is like a really good point, like a full circle moment. And I appreciate you for being the spark and the genesis for doing this, giving me a little kick and a little bit of like a little courage nugget to kind of come and do this, and to have this conversation, because I feel like this is important. You as a person who is a artist who came to do this residency, and your voice is vital. to that, and it's vital to that place as a voice that's not heard or centered, not only at Esalen, but we know most places. So I'm really grateful to you. Yeah, and I hope that this is like the start of really having this conversation more deeply. So thank you. And thanks to Sam
Yeah.
for opening the floor.
Yes, thank you. Opening and cracking the floor wide open.
Yes, and yeah, and I'm really appreciative. And where can people find you?
People can find me. I keep plugging Black Beyond. My ad is Jazsalyn. It's my name, so on Instagram. But Black Beyond's ad is at Black Beyond _. You can also find us at blackbeyond.xyz. And I had spoken of a recent event that we did, Origins, which is, it lives online. So we can provide those links, I guess, down below.
Yeah, in the show notes, we'll make sure we have links to Jazsalyn and to Black Beyond, and to this recent work as well. If folks want to follow Esalen, that would be great on all of our channels. We are at Esalen on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And if you want to follow me specifically, I am at Michelle on Instagram.
Yeah, this has been good, and I'm glad that we connected. I forgot to mention, but Black Beyond is also planning our first in-person exhibition for Black History Month at Parsons.
Great.
In the Kellen Gallery. So we have more information on that. We'll put that below as well.
Thank you, Jazsalyn. Thank you for this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Michelle.
Today's show is produced in conjunction with Michelle McCrary and Peter Kobabe. Our music is by Nico Holloman. If you like what you hear, please subscribe. Email me with your thoughts at voices@esalen.org. If you can't come to Big Sur, our Digital Extended Education Program, or DEEP, offers an online Esalen workshop you can experience from the comfort of your home. The first 6-week workshop, We're All Gonna Die, led by Reverend Bodie B., kicks off on January 10th, 2022. Bodie will lead students through an exploration of how a healthy life includes a healthy relationship to death, and how that awareness can help shape who we are as a community and how we care for each other now and when we're dying. The second online course, Moon Lodge, begins January 17th, 2022. Moon Lodge is a 6-week online workshop focused on celebrating the body of women and the sacred feminine within. Instructors Lucia Haran and Dr. Julia Vaughn will share in the sisterhood of humanity and all that it encompasses. Register now at esalen.org/learn.